Hey everyone, and welcome to the tutorial series for the procedural park. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the entrances and the pathways that we create for our park. And these two things are tied together, and you'll see just in a minute, right? Depending on the number of entrances that we decide our park should have, that will determine how many pathways will be created, because one entrance obviously requires a specific path. We also require pathways to connect the central actors. So we're going to be taking a look at how much to change the number of entrances, whether we want corner entrances or not, whether we want some padding added to the entrances. And as far as the pathways, we're going to be taking a look at the pathway classes, some of the generation settings. There's a bunch. We're not going to take a look at every single one for the sake of keeping the video relatively short. And then we're going to be looking at some of the options that are included in the pathway blueprint, such as how to create bridges, change the mesh, and add support. All right, so if we go back and jump into Unreal, we're right here. I'm going to go ahead and close some of the stuff that I've had open from the previous video. If you haven't been doing this in order, just make sure that you open level tutorial and drop in your park. And what we're going to look at now is how do we determine the pathway generation. So remember, we're going to make this a little bit smaller. So let's just click on Big Park, set parameters, and we're going to zoom in here. And notice now that because we use their separate parameters, if we go down here into setup generation, we have an area called entrance details. And if we go ahead and expand this, we'll see two very simple settings. How many entrances do we want? And whether we want corner entrances. Now, when I was looking at how to create the entrances, one of the community members mentioned that usually parks have entrances in the corners. And this is very true if you look at parks in the city. And the reason for that is because if you have streets, you want to make sure that the corners of the streets or the intersections, that's usually where people are walking, and you want to make sure that you have entrances there. So by default, this is selected. So in this case, if we want to spawn 5 entrances, we will spawn 4 entrances, 1 on each corner, and then 1 additional entrance in a random location between the corner entrances. So the way this works is, if you have this selected, it'll first spawn 4 entrances in the corner, and then whatever's left, it'll pick a random side. In this case, let's say it picks this, and then after that, it'll pick a random location along the edge to spawn that entrance. So let's go ahead and spawn our central actors here. And we only have 1. Let's make sure that we change that. Let's make sure that we I don't know, let's make 3 just to make it more interesting. We have 3 central actors that we wanted to spawn. And now when we click on create pathways, notice that we have 5, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4 corners, and then we have an additional pathway that is created on a random size, 5. Now, if we click on generate pathways again, notice what happens. It'll again try to spawn 5, but because the 4 corners are taken, it'll just try to spawn an additional one in a random place. So I can keep clicking here and notice that we keep adding pathways, but the corners are set. So only additional pathways that are in random sites are selected. And that's because when it traces to the corner, it notices that, hey, there's already a pathway there, so I'm not going to spawn there, right? We can change this number to whatever we want. Now, let's say that we don't want corner entrances, and we can deselect this. And now we're going to have 5 entrances in completely random locations, right? So we can go back here and say, okay, now spawn your central actors. In this case, we have 2, that's fine. And create the pathways. Notice that in this case, we spawn 3, and they're not in the corner at all. They're just in random locations. So you do have the option. I'm going to keep clicking on create pathways, and you can see that now they are spawning pretty much in any of the areas, surface areas on each side except the corners. We're specifically avoiding the corners. So you can see that we have a very different design here. And you can see that if I'm going to make the park a little bit bigger, like a really big park, as you can see. Notice that as I keep clicking create pathways, more and more pathways are being spawned on the outside of the park, but the pathways that connect the inner parts of the park, right? The central actors, look at the central actors here, we have 3, have not changed. And that's because I'm dividing the pathway generation into 2 sets. First, just so you understand, the first thing I'm doing is when I spawn my actors here, I'm spawning pathways that connect the central actors first. And those pathways use a specific class. So if you click here, I'm going to under pathways, pathway details, notice that we have 2 classes, inner path class and outer path class. In this case, I'm using the exact same class, but you can change it. So the inner path is first generated. Make sure that you have connections here. And then once this is done, the outer path is generated, which creates the entrances and connects everything. So maybe you want to have the inner path have a different material or a completely different mesh. Maybe you want the mesh of the pathways inside the park to have borders, for example, or a rail or whatever it is. So this is the reason why we break it down into 2. The more you click create pathways, the more outer path you spawn, but the inner pathways are kept the same. And the reason is you don't want 2 or 3 different pathways inside convoluting the center of the park, right? So that is the distinction between those 2. One thing I forgot before we continue on the pathways, if you go back to the entrances here, you have values here that says edge entrance padding and entrance distance check. And this is important. These distances are used to know how close you want the entrances to spawn. So let's say that you have a corner entrance here, and we're going to go ahead and click on create pathways. Notice that the path, if you click here, I'm going to go into game mode. Notice that the pathway is it doesn't start exactly at the corner of the park. It has been moved to the inside of the park by a specific amount, and that amount right there is what I call the not the central park, the entrance padding, edge entrance padding. And the reason for that is because if you want your park to be exactly this volume, if you spawn something on the edge, you're going to have a little bit of that mesh outside of the park bounds. So you can change this padding to whatever you want to make sure that the edges are inside of your park. And this distance check is basically the distance as I'm tracing that I'm using to make sure that the entrances or the pathways are not starting way too close together. Okay? That's pretty much it. Now let's go back to the pathways here. Pathway details. You have a few values here. You have the pathway generation settings, which is a lot of things, and then the distance to close the pathway and the distance to level the pathway. We're gonna take a look at that in a second, but if you expand the generation settings, you see that there's a lot of information here. Now, when you select your park size and you click on auto parameters, I've already selected the optimal settings here for you. But we're going to go through some of these just so you understand. The segment, the max segment per path is just an upper bound. It's basically saying no single path should have more than 500 segments, and that's for performance reasons, right? It's good to have an upper limit. The path length means that every single segment will have a length of 1500 units. So I am creating the pathway segment by segment. And the smaller the segments, the more variation you can have in your park. But the less performant it will become, because every single segment is another mesh that the pathway has. Max turn angle is basically saying every single time we spawn a new segment, how much can we change the angle of the segment. And by default here is 40 degrees to the left and 40 degrees to the right. And then a continue bias is basically what is the percentage chance that the that the pathway segment will continue in the same direction as the previous segment. And in this case, it's 40%. And the max slope to spawn is if there's a huge wall, for example, which would have a slope of 90 degrees, you don't want to spawn, for example, a path that goes up that 90 degrees, right? And then you have the trace bounds, and this is used just for tracing the path. Now you have some settings here, and you've seen this on the procedural city generator too. And you have some settings here, like you have grid-like, mild curves, heavy curves, and organic. So if you click on grid-like, for example, and click on set parameters, and you go down here, notice now that we have some settings that are changed. The max turn angle per segment is 0. We don't want the angles to change. And the continue bias is 85%. So what happens now if I have these settings is, if I spawn my actors and I click on create pathways, notice that the pathways are very straight. Every single segment, the pathways tend to be grid-like, as I said. However, if I remove everything again and I spawn my actors and I decide that no, I want my pathways to be more organic, so I change it from grid-like to organic. I set my parameters and I generate my pathways. Notice that now there are more curves. You can all of these settings, all they're doing is changing the values here, right? The max turn angle is 40. You can manually change this even more to set up your own to get to your own settings. So for example, the max turn angle is 40. I can make this 60. The continue bias, instead of 40%, I want it to be only 10%, for example. And the trace bounds, I'm going to reduce this so there is a chance that the pathways are going to overlap even less. By doing all this, if I come down here, up here, and click on generate pathways, the pathways now have a chance to be more windy. And you can see that even more if I make the park bigger, right? So let's make this like a massive park, for example. Set the parameters, and I go down here to the generation. I'm going to do this quickly. And we say the path segment length, instead of being 2000, I want it to be 500. So there's more chance that each individual segment can have a variation of up to 60 degrees with a continue bias of 1%. And I'm going to change the trace bounds to about 200. If I click on create pathways, oops, central actors, notice that now we have a bunch of pathways, and the likelihood that the pathways are going to be windy is extremely high. Now, this is terrible for performance, as you can probably see in my editor as I'm moving around, because I have so many different pathways, as you can see here. So go ahead and play around with those settings. Notice that I'm just going to show, for example, my FPS here. Notice that my FPS right now is 17 or 10 to 15. If I remove the pathways and set the parameters to what I consider to be the default, and then create the pathways, notice that my FPS is 80% because the pathway settings that I've selected are a lot lighter. Notice that my pathway segments are much longer. It's 2000 units instead of 500, and the amount that they can curve is much less. So my recommendation is go ahead and play with those settings. I've kind of shown you a little bit here, but ideally you would stick to the defaults that I've created. Those would make sure that you keep your park's performance high, right? And you can see here. But if you wanted to, you can again change the max angle, the continue bias, and the segment length. Those values will be the biggest contributors to how your pathway looks. There's also a placement mode here. I'm not going to take a look at this now. We're going to take a look at this in a separate video. But just like the central actors, you can have your pathway aligned to the landscape. So if you have a mountain, the pathway will try to follow the mountain. You can have your landscape aligned to your pathway. In this case, it'll carve the mountains. It'll create a pathway through the mountain. Or you can select keep the same height, and the pathway will simply keep the exact same height as the original height it had, and it'll just carve through the mountains, for example. But it won't do anything else. All right, and there's one more thing that I wanted to show before we wrap up the video, which is some of the options that you have on your pathway. So the pathway BP isn't just a blueprint that allows you to create pathways, obviously, but you actually have the ability to make some changes here. So go ahead and create your pathways here, and we're gonna go ahead and select one of these pathways here. So just select the pathway, and this is BP generic pathway 467, for example. Notice that we have a bunch of options under setup. These are splines, by the way, which means that you can modify the pathway. You can select a single spline and you can modify the pathway. So you can see here, right? So don't feel like once you generate the pathways, it is what it is, right? If this is too straight, select the spline point, you can change it. You can also add spline points. I can right click and click on add spline point here, and then I can change the pathway to whatever I want. Right? This goes to all of the pathways here. In addition, I'm going to select this guy right here. You have a few other options. Spline mode only, it'll only show the splines. So if you have a really long pathway and moving the splines is causing performance issues, notice my frame rate goes from like 90% to like 27%, right? You can change and say spline mode only, and that'll make sure that your performance stays high. Then you can disable it. You also have some path defaults, and you can, for example, you notice that we have some numbers here, 2, 3. You can choose to show or hide a specific segment. So for example, you have 9 segments here, and we're going to expand the segment number 1, which is this segment here. Segment 1 is this area from here to here. So you can expand it here and say, I actually don't want to show this segment, and you can hide it. Right? Maybe you want to have something else go on, right? Or you have a different mesh that you want to use here. You can go ahead and hide it. You can also change the mesh, right? And right now, by default, the ground segment meshes are used, and it's this mesh right here. It's just a little mesh with a little stone material. But if you select the option of over water, and you select this, notice that now the mesh that is placed in that segment is a mesh of a bridge. And the mesh is right here, water segment mesh. And if I open it here, it's just a little mesh with a little wooden bridge with some rails. And the reason for that is because if you had a river, for example, or a lake, what you could do is you could manually come here and say, for this area right here that we have a lake, I want this segment to display, to be over water, and use the water segment mesh. And you can do that on a per segment basis, right? You can do other things, like you can change the width and the thickness on a segment. So for example, you said for segment 1, I want the start width to be 1, but the end width scale to be 2. And notice what happens here. It starts skinny, then it grows and grows and grows until it gets here. And then you can go to segment 2 and say, okay, well, I want the starting width to be 2, but the ending width to be 1. And now what you've done is your pathway starts at a width, and then it grows and grows and grows, and eventually gets skinnier again. So you have those options there. You also have the option of changing the landscape. Right, so let's say that I want to grab this guy here and I want to increase its width. Actually, this is not a good example. Let's just go back here. Take this guy right here. Say that I wanted to increase this guy, and I'm going to make him taller here, and I'm going to add another spline point here. Just to, there you go, kind of like that. What I could do now is I could add supports. So you have the option of adding support, and if you click here, notice that now we have some support that is actually spawning here in the case that you wanted to make like a little bridge. So let's say that for section 2, I want to make a bridge. I can come here to section 2 and say this is over water. And notice that now, if I click play, even though this is super unrealistic, you have a little bridge with supports. And again, this is mostly used for going over a river or a lake. But usually you would want to have some support that spawns there. So those are the options that you have. And you have add support to endpoint, add support to initial point. You can flatten all points, for example. And you have a minimum support distance. You probably don't want to change these too much, but these are the options that you have. And finally, you have some settings for landscape, which again, I'm not going to touch too much, but you can probably guess what this does. What you can do here is you can select your landscape and you can say, I want to align the landscape to my path. And if you click here, you see that now the landscape has now aligned to your path. I'm going to go ahead and click undo. Or you have the option of aligning this to the floor, which is kind of the opposite. And you can see that it's aligned now to the floor. And if you wanted to make sure that you update the path, you come up here and you say reset defaults. And deselect it, and now your path is here. So you can align your path to the floor, or you can align the floor, the landscape, to your path. And you can also apply materials. And this is the exact same thing. If I click on apply materials, you'll notice that now we have a dirt material that has been applied here. Now, if you've been keeping track of the generation of the park, you notice that we do this automatically by clicking on the option here of apply path material. And when you click here, you're basically going through every single path and doing exactly what I just did here. You're basically running this custom event that applies the material. However, you could do it individually, or maybe you want this path to apply a different material, then you could do it this way. So a lot of flexibility here, and like I said, we're going to take a look at modifying the landscape in a different video where I'm going to show you how to do it with mountains and how you would do it for individual pathways, central actors, and props. Because there's some manual adjustment that you need to do there. But this is it. These are the general settings that you would find for generating your pathways. Like I said, there are some other settings that I didn't touch. You can go ahead and play around with those. If you have any questions about how the generation works, obviously you can take a look at the code yourself, or you can leave a comment in the video and I'll try to explain it further. All right, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video.